What's up, horror fans? Pete here from the Lasser Cast with my co-host with the most, with his Evil Dead shirt, Danny Torkel. Oh, such a hot shirt, such a hot man. Danny, you ready to talk about Evil Dead?
I am, and this is actually one of the oldest shirts I own. It was on the Charlotte had never seen it, it's an extra large, so it never really fit me too well until now, which says a lot.
All right. Well, I'm glad it's nice and snug on you right now. We are talking about Evil Dead 2013. Came out 10 years ago. And why are we doing this? Because we are on our way to Evil Dead Rise, which is coming out this year.
Like
Danny,
not
go ahead.
even not even like later this year, isn't it? Like spring?
Oh, I don't know the exact date. We've gotten a lot of reviews because it just actually premiered at South by Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
And got some interesting reviews right here. There was one guy that showed up at the Paramount Theater and he said basically, this movie fucking sucks. And they like kicked him out of the theater. I'm kind of jealous. I could have gone there. I've been to the Paramount multiple times. But from those reviews, there's this one beautiful line in here. It says, for Evil Dead Rise, a very violent horror pick that keeps you on the edge of your seat and beats you off. So I'm looking forward to that.
I knew it was coming.
So did she. Yeah. So anyway, that's my the Adam review, by the way. So everyone's excited about Evil Dead Rise. We're here to talk about Evil Dead 2013, which I think a lot of people in the horror community say is like underappreciated. What would you say, Danny?
Well, also, just for like people who actually follow our channel, like this is the only Evil Dead movie / property that we have not really talked about. Charlotte and I, because I'm a good parent, she's watched the original trilogy, starting with Sam Raimi's 1980 to 81 original, through Army of Darkness, and we did reviews of those. And then Charlotte and I watched all 3 seasons of Ash versus Evil Dead, and we did reviews of those. And then we did a trailer review of Evil Dead Rise with a few guests.
Mhm.
Mike Mangiorno was on there. I think Derek Stockton might have been on there as well.
And Brian.
Yeah. Oh, and Brian Corson from Comic Books Transformed as well. So we've talked about Evil Dead. Evil Dead is, for my money, my favorite horror franchise because you have 4 movies so far, Evil Dead Rise being the 5th.
Yeah.
All of the 4 movies are so uniquely different and great, in my opinion.
Right.
And then you have a 3-season-long series, which is freaking great. So
Okay.
there's not even like a lull anywhere in it. Whereas every other franchise, there's always kind of that one movie that everybody just throws right at the bottom and goes, okay, Halloween Resurrection, you're going to sit down there and we're going to talk about the rest of the franchise.
Right.
So as far as your question, what do I feel about 2013 and is it underappreciated? I really do think it's underappreciated because this movie came out a decade ago now, 10 years.
Yep.
And I remember one of my favorite moments in a movie theater, and I'm sure we'll talk about this soon, the ending of this movie is one of the first and only times, maybe pre-Endgame, where I audibly screamed in like happiness in a movie. There's a particular moment at the end where I just went, yes! And the people around me kind of gave like a, he's way too into this kind of thing. But if you're an Evil Dead fan, I honestly feel, and I felt this, and Charlotte watched this with me last night, and she even said at the end, she's like, yeah, I really thought that was better than I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel that this movie was in a really tricky situation because, you know, we've talked about this with Halloween, both 07 and 18. We've talked about this with Scream 5, even though it's just called Scream, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is actually has a connection to this movie.
Yep.
Unfortunately. This was a weird movie because it's called Evil Dead, but it's not really a remake, and it's not really a sequel.
No.
So it just kind of exists as a part of the franchise.
Right.
And so if you're walking into this movie thinking, okay, you know, and Charlotte even said this right before I pressed play. She's like, who's going to be Ash? And I went, well, there is no Ash.
Right.
You know, and she's like, oh. And she expected there to be 5 characters named Ash, Scotty, Cheryl, Sheila, and Linda. Or
Right.
Shelley and Linda. She expected this to be a remake, straight up from the original movie. And I think a lot of people did. And so if you're walking into this movie back in 2013, expecting it to be, oh, here we go, another horror remake.
Yeah.
You're kind of hit with a jab that goes like, oh, none of these characters are named Ash, so what is this?
Right.
Oh, maybe it's a sequel. No, this has nothing to do with any of those original 3.
Right.
And so you're kind of left with just what is in front of you. And I think what is in front of you is an absolutely glorious horror movie. It's, you know, it could kind of exist on its own.
Yep.
But it throws in enough homages to the original without there ever being, like, you could kind of use the DiCaprio meme of like, you know, like the necklace, you know, or there's in the Necronomicon. I paused it for Charlotte. They show the abomination, and the picture is like the abomination reaching out of the ground, and it's basically a riff on the original 1981 poster for the Evil Dead.
Right.
And I'm like, look, those are things that like the super hardcore fans like us are going to pick up on, and a casual horror movie audience is just going to be like, cool.
Right.
And because of that, because this movie kind of lives on its own and does its own thing, I really think it does it. I really think it's so good. And there's parts of me, like I'm so attached to the original 1981 original. It's such like a part of my life as a horror fan.
Right.
But I kind of, and I've heard Sam Raimi mention this, like, this is like a movie that if the technology existed and if he had a little bit more than the no money he had back then, he would have made something like this. Yeah. Like, this movie used, I looked on IMDb, between 50 and 70,000 gallons of blood.
Oh my God.
I mean, the last scene on its own.
Right.
When it starts raining blood. I think I read that entire scene was about 50,000 gallons of blood on its own.
Jesus
and
Christ.
Like, this is a movie, if you're a fan of the original especially, because there is nothing funny about the original Evil Dead. It, you know, maybe in retrospect, you know, knowing what Bruce Campbell would become in the sequels, you could kind of watch it with a little bit of tongue in cheek.
Right.
But if you're watching it for the first time in the early 80s, or when I watched it for the first time in probably the early to mid 90s, there's nothing funny about that movie. And so to get a pure balls to the wall, scary horror movie version of the Evil Dead for the first time, 2013, in 30 plus years, it was pretty glorious.
Yeah, well, you touched upon a lot of interesting points there, right? I think that it's real interesting considering that the 2013 audience and the 2023 audience have a few things in common. You know, by 2013, we were already looking at things on the internet, and we were trying to speculate what's going to happen in this movie. Is this a sequel? Is it a reboot? You know, and we become so obsessed with it, you know, and because I think we're automatically assuming that a sequel is going to be better than a reboot, right? Like, since this movie, because this movie is in a weird time, right? It comes out in 2013. It's before all of the legacy sequels. Like, it's before that Halloween 2018 or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All these movies where they kind of are like a reboot, but they're also a sequel.
Yeah. And it's also after all of the like Platinum Dunes era horror remakes.
Right.
Like Texas Chainsaw, Friday the 13th,
Right.
Nightmare on Elm Street, where they were just like Amityville Horror. There was just this streak in the early 2000s where it was, you name a horror movie from the early 80s, and we're going to give it a gritty, like real hardcore remake, courtesy of Michael Bay and Platinum Dunes. Yeah.
And so that brings up a question I wanted to ask you. I want to get your opinion on, because I value your opinion on this. Is that do you think that during that kind of period of time between the Legacy sequels and those Platinum Dune remakes, do you think that like horror movies were like kind of intentionally mean? Like, do you think that we kind of went through a phase where it's like people went to horror movies to see some like fucked up shit? I understand that. Go ahead.
Well, there was also, that period was basically in America, it was a lot of horror remakes, but then you also had the rise of J horror at the time. And then you also had, and I hate this phrase, but you had the torture porn subgenre, like Saw. The original Saw comes out in 2003, I think. And then there's basically a sequel every year to year and a half. You have 2 theatrical Hostel movies coming out in that 2005 to 7 range.
Right.
You even had Rob Zombie's Halloweens 1 and 2, which are like hillbilly hardcore horror. You're going to get Michael Myers doing extreme violence while somebody else is yelling just insanely inappropriate language in the background. But then also right around the time this came out, I think you actually started to see like a turn where you got James Wan kind of leaving, he directed the original Saw and then pretty much handed the franchise off to the people that ran the sequels. And then he basically starts the Conjuring universe in 2013. I think the first Conjuring movie is 2013.
Oh, I think you're right.
Like, to me, that's like almost the opposite of mean horror, because it's all about the family. It's multiple families. You have, the family that's being attacked by the spirit, and then you have obviously the Warrens who come and help clan. It's all about like the power of love and God and family to save them from the evil. So there's good horror, but it's also, I think in that period you start to kind of change a little bit. And then just a few years later, you'd start to see like A24 come in and start to do what they're doing with, another phrase that I hate, but elevated horror, but really just different takes on this, on these things. You had movies like, Hereditary comes out in 2018, which is a few years obviously after this, but I think it's really interesting looking at the differences between Halloween 2007 and Halloween 2018, where it's like you have 2 movies called Halloween that are both either a remake or a requel, and how different those 2 movies are. And you go from like mean, nasty, just like in your face, to like, oh, we're going back to like a more familial aspect of this horror movie where, there's going to be violence, but there's also going to be things to latch onto. And I think this movie kind of does fall in that middle area, because the crux of this story is not just 5 random teenagers, 5 random 20-somethings show up at a cabin in the woods. This is a brother and sister story where the sister's a drug addict and her friends and family are there to basically try to get her clean and make her go cold turkey. And they're going to keep her in this cabin in the woods with no way out. And, shit happens, to progress the plot. And I'm sure we'll talk about the character that I think most easily gets maligned from this movie is Lou Taylor Pucci's Eric, who is just like a stereotype, like platform of, here's a list of things not to do in a horror movie. And now he's going to be like, oh, okay, number 1, open up the barbed wire sealed book. B, open the book that is clearly written that says, don't read or write these words. Oh, let me write them down and then read them out loud. You know,
Right.
it's almost like borderline, like it's almost tongue in cheek without being tongue in cheek. You know. Speaking
Agreed.
of tongue in cheek, that comes later in the bathroom. Uh,
Whoa, yeah, yeah, got him. Well, okay. So we were talking about it like maybe being in this weird kind of time period, and then you actually mentioned Cabin in the Woods, which came out in 2011, which I
yes.
know obviously was influenced by the original Evil Dead movies 1 and 2 a lot too. Um, I kept thinking about one movie in particular, which came out way before this movie in 2004. I kept thinking about High Tension, right? I know that you're a big fan of that French horror
Yeah.
wave that was like this like brutal French. What's it
French
called?
extremity, French extremist movement. Yeah, like
Right.
that was the early 2000s, pretty much in America that started with High Tension, but
Yeah.
then in France you got movies like Inside, Martyrs, Frontiers,
Yeah.
all sorts of just like real gruesome, gory horror. Yeah.
And so I want to bring up 2 points about this movie because you mentioned the idea of it's a brother and sister story, and they're trying to have it's like get her to quit cold turkey essentially in a cabin in the woods. So I think it has like this perfect setup for all of the horror cliches. Like, why are we staying in the cabin? We're seeing all these horrible signs. We should leave right away. But no, we're not, because we're committed to her quitting drugs, right? Like that's why we're staying. And who cares about cell phones and the car and stuff like that? We're staying in this spot because of our commitment to her. Oh, she's showing all these weird side effects. Well, that's just because she's going through withdrawal. It's not because maybe there's some kind of demonic presence. I think that's so fucking brilliant. But what I was gonna say was, I know that like obviously there isn't this like one period of time in horror movie history where it's like gets more brutal. Like there's been brutal horror movies throughout every decade, right? Especially going back just to the 70s, right? But we've covered all the different decades when we reviewed 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments of All Time. And the director of this movie, Fede Alvarez, was a big talking piece on that show. He talked a lot throughout the show. And it's interesting because this is his first feature, right? And I just kind of felt like there's this sort of like you're like this non-American sensibility to the brutality of this movie. Like it's very much a brother sister story, like you're saying, but this movie is like really fucking mean to like all of the characters in this movie. They do horrible things to all the characters in this movie.
Yeah. Like there's at one point Charlotte was watching and with Eric's character, I mean, I feel like that's why I feel like there is a level of tongue in cheek to that character because
Yeah.
he goes, it's like, okay, here's a list of things not to do. I'm going to do all of them. And then he pays the price more than any character. Like he is beaten and brutalized so badly.
Yeah.
That like his character even says at one point, dead, dying probably isn't a bad thing right now. And I'm like, and Charlotte's like, oh my God, can he just die already? And it's like how many nails, how many times does he have to be stabbed with a needle, sliced with glass, shot with a nail gun, have his hands split down the middle by a crowbar, beaten in the head with the crowbar, like left to die face down in a puddle of sludge in the basement. It's just like, my Lord.
Yes.
And then, of course, we mentioned, I kind of used it as like a jokey. By the way, did you know that Lou Taylor Pucci, the character who plays Eric, he's the main character in Spring? Cut off all of his hair.
Oh my God, it is. Yeah. Holy shit. Yeah, that's right.
I'm looking at his face and I'm like, he looks really familiar. And I IMDb'd him and I went, oh my God, he cut it because like his IMDb picture is him with short hair. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. Makes so much more sense.
Oh, I love that movie.
But yeah, like what happens to Jessica Lucas, the actress who plays Olivia. Eric's girlfriend, who's the nurse. And I like that there's an actual reason for these characters to be there, like you said, especially Eric and Olivia are friends of Mia. They've grown up with her. and David, but mostly with her, it seems. And they've been through this before with her. They talk about how she OD'd and her heart had stopped, and they pretty much had to defibrillate her back to life. And Olivia's there as a nursing student to like give her the medication she needs to get through the withdrawal. And she gets the face full of blood vomit, and then she's the first one possessed really after Mia. Right. And she, with the glass, I remember seeing that scene in the trailer, like, what is she doing to herself? And when you realize, there's a very Joker-esque quality to that scene.
Yep.
Especially the way that they've done it in the comics, or I think on Gotham even, where the Joker slashes his own face off.
Yeah.
But just absolutely disgusting stuff. And then there's the scene with Natalie where she gets bitten and her. So not to like the brutality. Every character goes through just so much. Absolute gore, and like everybody loses body parts and it has body parts mangled in awful ways. But I love how this movie uses that to again kind of play with your expectations. Charlotte is watching this, waiting to see who Ash is, and if there's no character named Ash, who's going to be the main character? And the most obvious character set up to be that is David, played by Shiloh Fernandez. He's Mia's brother.
Right.
He even wears the blue shirt. He's got short hair. He doesn't look like Bruce Campbell, but he's a Bruce Campbell type, especially in this cast, this very small cast. And so you're watching and you're kind of waiting for him. But then you see... Natalie is the one who uses the electric, meat cutting saw?
Meat slicer,
Yeah, to cut her arm off. And when she does that, and really at that moment, it's done to prevent her from being possessed.
Right.
And Charlotte was convinced at that point that Natalie, who's the least important character in this, barely in the movie until she has to cut her own arm off.
Right.
That all of a sudden she's like, she's going to be Ash. And I'm like, because Ash cut his hand off, if that scene's happening with this other. So when she shows up a few minutes later, possessed, shooting nails into her face with a nail gun, Charlotte was like, wait, she's possessed now? I'm like, yep. And to really play on the expectations, it's actually the character of, going back to the original, Cheryl, the first person who is possessed, the whole tree rape scene in the original, which is somehow not as graphic in this movie, thank God. It's still bad, but it's nothing as bad as the tree rape scene in the original.
Right.
But Cheryl in the original movie is the first possessed and really is the leader of the Deadites. Everybody else becomes a Deadite, but she's the one that he's fighting at the very end. And so you kind of expect Mia is going to be the one who is going to have to fight David at the end, as David heroically overcomes the evil.
Right.
And then for her to come full circle and end up being the survivor is again such a glorious subversion of expectations. Especially for the Evil Dead fans in the crowd and the Evil Dead fans watching.
Right.
Well,
let's play with that for a second, because we keep kind of talking about how this movie just came out at this weird time, right? And in 2013, you are just ahead of the subverting of expectations, which seems to happen all the time now, where it's like, oh, we're going to gender swap this, or we're going to race swap this. This was a little bit ahead of its time by having the Ash character be Mia. And it totally did subvert your expectations, because she's the first one to get infected. Or possessed. I wanted to go back to what you were saying, though. When we talk about the gruesome ways people deform themselves or hurt each other, I think that's what makes this movie stand out for me, is because if we go back a little further to like the early 2000s, late 90s, you'll have like a scene where you'll see someone's like fucked up face because something horrible happened, but it's just a quick flash and then you leave, right? This movie, like the original two Evil Dead movies, really like lingers in the fucking insanity. You know, like there's all this stuff with Bruce Campbell in the first two movies where it just kind of keeps going and escalating and getting weird, and we don't move on to the next thing. In this, it's like she's chopping away at her fucking face. Then she's like stabbing him in the eyeglasses. And there's that one sequence where like the needle part goes into the place right under his eye, and you see him slowly pull it out.
So wait, I have a question for you because we both just rewatched it. What is the scene in this movie that makes you go the most? Oh, because there's one for me, and it's probably not what you're thinking.
I think it might be that pulling out the eyeball part, like where it's right underneath his eyeball, because they hold there. Yeah, go ahead. What you got? A different one?
For me, it's when Mia's in the shed at the end, and the machete goes through and just slices the top of her knee, and then the slow pullback. And I'm in bed and I'm watching it with Charlotte, and I'm just like, oh,
yeah. But that's one thing this movie does really well is makes you feel that like flesh is being cut. They do that really well.
And with the exception of I think some of the fire gags in the movie, especially like the very beginning where like the kind of prologue scene where like there's very little CGI in this movie. Like Fede Alvarez tried. I read that there was access, obviously it's 2013, to CGI, and he intentionally try to make it as practical as possible as an ode to the original films. I love the look of the movie. I like the feel of this movie. Like, and that's also the balls to take a property that by that point was 2 out of 3 movies were basically horror light, mostly kind of screwball. You know, Evil Dead 2 has its moments of being scary. It's still my all-time favorite. I love it because it's just it is what it is, and what it is perfect. But it's not a movie I'm going to put on if I want to be scared. The original still holds up to me as a legitimate scary movie, but this is just something almost darker than the original movie. You know, and more like viscerally violent than the original movie. Like even in the original, when like you see when Scotty hacks up Shelly at the beginning of the original, you kind of just see him bringing the axe down, and then you see like body parts on the floor, like, but you don't like this movie is like, you know that pain when you skin your knee? Well, we're going to make you endure that for 12 straight seconds, slowly and painfully. Have you ever like accidentally stapled something into your hand and you have to pull it out and it hurts? We're going to make you do that, but close to your eye. And Fede Alvarez followed this movie up with Don't Breathe. Which also starred Gene Levy. And then I think there was kind of a separating of those two. Like there were conflicting reports where like, why wasn't she going to be in Don't Breathe 2? And she tweeted, some things that make me feel like there was some kind of behind the scenes thing. I don't want to, talk about things I don't know, but definitely seems like there was a riff there. And Jane Levy has since gone on to be like, Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. Athena watches that. And it's like this like bubbly musical comedy drama show. And it's fun. I've watched episodes with Athena and I'm just watching it going, man, I wish she would, rip off her own hand and throw a chainsaw into somebody's face again. Because she was so good. And, it's like that sometimes when you get these, and Charlotte watching this movie, Charlotte compared Jane Levy and her performance in this to a lot of recent Jenna Ortega stuff. And I could totally see a comparison where you have this like very diminutive, small, leading female
Right.
who you don't expect to be doing the level of, hardcore, violent, gory shit that they're doing.
Right.
And you got, Jenna Ortega between the two Scream movies, X, which she was in last year,
Right.
Wednesday, of course, where she showed off, her comedy chops as well as, within a horror confine. I could totally see that as a comparison. And,
Right.
I think Jane Levy proved in just the two movies she did between this and Don't Breathe that she has the chops should she ever choose to come back to horror, that she can, fit back in seamlessly, because she really is the force that carries this movie.
Right. Well, I actually wanted to talk about her return with you, but before I did that, I need to make sure that I point out the cinematography of this movie. This movie, like, we talk about how brutal it is and how upsetting and gross it can be, but it's also like really fucking beautiful to look at. Like, the cinematography is by Aaron Morton, and I guess he should get some praise too while we're talking about it. I keep thinking about that one scene, like the tree rape scene that you're talking about in this movie, where she's confronted with like her doppelganger, right? And the doppelganger is just staring at her, and we do these like close-ups of her face, and we do close-ups of the doppelganger's face, and it's just like this amazing, horrific image. Like the shots of like her, like I'm using for the thumbnail, I'm using her under the floorboards, pushing her head up and stuff, and obviously that's from the original movie, and you have it on your shirt, right? But this movie just looks so fucking good. It's like sleek, but it's also gritty. It's beautiful, but it's also horrendously awful. So the other thing I wanted to bring up too is you mentioned at the beginning of the show that there's 3 seasons of Ash versus the Evil Dead. Now I know that behind the scenes, like Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell have been trying to make like a sequel to Army of Darkness and continue Ash's story. And then this movie came out. And then after this movie, they did Ash versus Evil Dead. And I was just wondering, like, what's the connective tissue? Because I know that, like, when this movie ends, when you get to the end credits, you just see the side of Ash's face, and he like turns and he goes, or he says groovy, and then he turns, right? Like, is there any connective tissue from this movie to the Ash versus Evil Dead show?
I don't necessarily think so. I mean, aside from totally randomly, there's one actress at the very beginning. There's the woman who's speaking, I think, Welsh, telling the dad to like kill the daughter in the cabin.
Yes.
That actress actually does show up in Ash vs. Evil Dead and is one of the Deadites, like first Deadites killed by Ash. So that's a connective tissue. But I just feel like the idea of the book, and whatever version of the book it is, whether it's the one from the original trilogy with the that has like the face on it,
right,
or Ash vs. Evil Dead where they kind of use the same one, just the kind of concept of the Necronomicon and the reading from the pages, and it's really amazing that all you need to really do is read like one word and you're like, shit, that's it. The Evil Dead is here, and you're on a camera. You're speaking of cinematography. You're on a camera speeding through the woods, dollying around, like crazy.
But like in this movie, it's not called the Necronomicon, right? Like when I was looking it up, it's called the Notarum Demonto, right?
Oh,
and like
that phrase is uttered in the original Evil Dead when they have the recording of the professor, and he says it's like Notarum Demonto, loosely translated, the Book of the Dead.
Yeah,
and then it becomes. I mean, that exact book is then referenced later as the Necronomicon.
Okay. And then, like, in this movie, there's the Taker of Souls, and they have to claim 5 souls to unleash the abomination. So
which is funny considering that it does come out right after, a couple of years after Cabin in the Woods, which is also, you have to take the 5 souls and you know, you kind of have those characters here in a variation of a way, right?
Right.
You know, David kind of seems like you have your typical jock. He has the blonde girlfriend. Then you have the other couple. Eric kind of seems like he might be. I guess Mia would actually be the stoner guy, being that she's there to be cleansed of a drug habit.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, so there's obviously those parallels, right? But like in the Ash vs. the Evil Dead show, right? Do they go into the lore at all? Like, do they kind of give specific names for Deadites and stuff in it?
There are a few demons from the book, like Baal was one in season 2.
Yeah.
That's brought back by Lucy Lawless. And there's other specific Deadites or specific demons that are listed that like come and I mean, the finale of Ash vs. Evil Dead, like the big giant demon that's walking around has a name. I don't remember it now. But
oh yeah,
yeah, there definitely are.
Because I haven't watched. I watched like maybe the first 2 or 3 episodes, but I haven't watched the whole thing. I think it's streaming on like Paramount Plus or something.
It was on Netflix for years. Now it was on another. Yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean, I have them on Blu-ray. I could just send you the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think you did. I think you actually did send me the first Blu-ray.
Yeah, I think I did. No, I think I sent you. I might have sent you the whole series.
Yeah,
you should find that.
So then, here's the question. Then, right, is that they say on the Wikipedia that Evil Dead Rise is a sequel to this. Do you think that that's just bullshit, or they don't know what they're talking about, or what do you think?
I don't. I have no idea. I think that's a great question to ask when we see Evil Dead Rise. I'm very intrigued by Evil Dead Rise. I'm wondering if the people who are reviewing it and the reviews, except for that one guy who seemingly hated it and stormed out.
Yeah.
Most of the reviews have been overwhelmingly positive to Evil Dead Rise.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if those people remember this movie.
I know.
Because a lot of the things they're saying, like, oh, the brutality, the violence, and I'm like, do you remember this one?
Right.
Because this one has some pretty gnarly shit. Like, and you know, thinking about the trailer, there's that scene where the Deadite mom jumps on the kid with like it looks like a tattoo needle, and she's holding it near his eye, and I'm like, okay, well, that reminds me of the bathroom scene here where Olivia is trying to stab Eric with the hypodermic needle and stabs him through the fucking glasses.
Yep.
Like, yeah, I mean, I'm really excited for Evil Dead Rise. Yeah. I was actually, I think, ironically, the least excited of our like panel discussion about it because I really do. I know, like, I think it was Mike Mangiorno who said he didn't really love this movie.
Oh, okay.
And like, I can totally see, you know, again, not loving this, but for as somebody who I love the original trilogy so much.
Yeah.
I grew up with those movies. Ash vs. Evil Dead was an amazing part of my life in the sense that from not just enjoying it as a fan, but from a professional standpoint, because I actually was reviewing those episodes for Geeks of Doom at the time. I was covering conventions. I was getting press passes to interview the cast members. Like I got to interview Bruce and Ray Santiago and Dana DiLorenzo, especially Dana DiLorenzo and Ray Santiago. I got to interview them multiple times for Ash vs. Evil Dead.
Yeah.
And it's just like that show it became something greater to me. You know, it was this like major event.
Yeah.
And so to have this movie, which kind of fits in that middle period as we started talking about, this movie it just works so perfectly for me. And that's, again, I think that's why it's easily my favorite horror franchise, because the 4 Evil Dead movies that exist right now before Evil Dead Rise comes out,
Mm-hmm.
are all completely different movies.
Yeah.
You have this, gritty, no budget, practical effects horror masterpiece from the early 80s, with the stop motion effects and all of these just blood on blood on blood. Then you have the slow descent into madness and horror comedy that is Evil Dead 2, where
Right.
you take Ash, who's really just kind of a nothing character in the original, and he becomes this icon of horror.
Right.
Then you have a complete comedy, like Three Stooges-esque comedy with horror aspects thrown in there, Army of Darkness, and it's perfect for what that is.
Right.
And then you have this like full circle back to, okay, hardcore, gritty, gory horror, but with a budget. And like you mentioned, cinematography. For me, that closing moment of this movie with the house on fire in the background.
Yeah.
And Mia, what does the abomination say? She doesn't say swallow your soul, but she's like, I'm going to feast on your soul. Oh, yeah. Feast on this motherfucker.
Right.
And so you have the house on fire in the background.
Yeah.
The cabin on fire in the background. You have Mia with a great final girl line, chainsaw to the face with blood shooting out everywhere while it's raining blood.
Yeah.
And I, like, to use a wrestling term, I popped big for this in the movie theater. Like, I was out of my seat going like, fuck yeah. Like, not realizing that I was in a movie theater. And because like that's my attachment to this franchise.
Yeah.
And like now, Evil Dead Rise is taking this kind of in a way that we just saw with Scream 6, taking something that is used to being in one location and moving the location. And sometimes something as simple as that elevates, not elevated horror, but elevates a property or a franchise to something a little bit grander. And now I'm looking forward to Evil Dead Rise even more. I'm seeing a lot of these people who I trust in the horror community on Twitter who are talking about like how much they enjoyed it. And I'm just thinking, oh man, this is going to be, I can't wait. I'm going to be there, whatever the first night is. And hopefully, in the wake of Scream and Scream 6, I'm hoping that this movie has a huge box office appeal, because I don't think Evil Dead 2013 was like necessarily a box office smash. Again, like 2013, like The Conjuring really was the movie that kind of brought horror fans back to theaters.
Yeah.
But horror is such a marketable genre now that to do like a big city Evil Dead movie, I feel like could be an actual box office hit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And before, when we were saying, like, when's it coming out? Isn't it coming out soon? I just looked up the date. It's April 21st. So you got
thank God. I'm back from spring break. I am going to be back in New York. That sounds like something that, just like with the Scream movies, we're going to get on top of shit right away and get our reviews out right away. I can't wait. I'm going to go probably to a Thursday night screening of it. I might even try to look up like Alamo or Nighthawk and see if there's like a cool, then again, this might not be the type of movie for a dine-in theater.
That's awesome. Yeah. So guys, 1 month from now, Danny and I will have our review, and we're going to do that shit together. I'm going to see it early too. I still haven't fucking seen Scream 6, but for this, I'm definitely going to see it. I love.
And if you want to see Scream 6, we have a couple reviews up on the channel.
Yes.
I got shockingly was able to get a press screening a few days early in the city. So I got my review up real early. So there's a spoiler-free review up on the channel. And then Charlotte and I went on the over that weekend, the opening weekend, and we did a full spoiler review. I spoiler, I really, really like Scream 6. Saw it twice. And I think it's firmly standing in my franchise rankings somewhere, either my favorite sequel or second favorite sequel right now. So it would either be
Whoa.
second or third in my franchise ranking in the Scream series.
Damn.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well,
Speaking
shit.
of that, how would you, we always do this on this channel. How would you rank the 4 Evil Dead movies?
Oh Christ! Oh, put me on the spot. Shit. I guess for me, I enjoy 2 the most. Then probably 1. Then this. Then Army of Darkness. Now I know like that might be sacrilege to some people. I like Army of Darkness a lot. I think it's very funny. It's a lot of fun. But as far as like satisfaction, I feel like this movie is more satisfying to me than Army of Darkness. What about you?
I think I'm exactly the same as you,
Okay.
but
Okay.
it's like I'm looking at it like 4 kids who just took a test, and it's like Evil Dead 2 is 100 plus. They did extra credit. Evil Dead 1, and really for me, I think this might be a better movie than the original Evil Dead, but my heartstrings pull me towards the original. Evil Dead, as like probably like the kid got like a 97, this kid got a 95, and then Army of Darkness got like a 92, but they have a big fucking smile on their face. So, and they're the class clown, so you like them. So
Yeah, right.
it's like there is no bad Evil Dead movie to me. I love them all for what they are, and they're all so different and yet also spectacularly awesome. And that's why that's my favorite franchise. Like, I think the second franchise that I would put up there is either Nightmare on Elm Street or Child's Play, Chucky, because even the bad ones of those franchises I enjoy.
Right.
Whereas, like, I don't enjoy Jason Takes Manhattan. I don't.
Right.
I don't. There are parts of some of the other Friday the 13th movies that I don't really enjoy.
Right.
I outright hate some of the Halloween movies. Like Michael Myers is my number 1 in terms of scariest horror villain.
Right.
But he's been in some of the worst horror movies I've ever seen.
Right.
Like, there's no redeeming value to Halloween Resurrection to me.
Right.
There's very little to look at for me anyway with Halloween Kills or Halloween 5 even. They're just bad movies, and I don't enjoy them. Whereas I enjoy every Freddy movie, even the really bad ones, even parts 5 and 6, even when Freddy is using the friggin' Nintendo Power Glove to kill a kid. I fucking enjoy that. In the Chucky franchise, like I think my least favorite Chucky movie is probably Child's Play 3.
Right.
There's plenty of things in that movie that I enjoy.
Right.
You know, it's just the bottom of a franchise. This movie though is 4 awesome movies that I love, and yeah, and then you throw on Ash vs. Evil Dead, 3 seasons of that on top of it. It just elevates it. So April 21st, you said Evil Dead Rise.
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yeah, so we'll be there and we're going to review and we're going to add that to the playlist for our Evil Dead reviews. And like Danny has said, there's reviews for each Evil Dead movie with him and with Charlotte. And then he also covers the Ash vs. Evil Dead show. And we're going to add this on there and then Evil Dead Rise. So make sure you guys check that out after you have liked this video and you subscribe. All right.